Welcome to the Battles We Pick podcast, where advocates and organizers talk about their work pushing for social, political, and policy change. Today's guest is Eileen Hershenov of the Anti-Defamation League, where she leads their initiative to defend democracy against the threat of autocracy and identity-based hate. Trained as an attorney, Eileen has been general counsel for Wikipedia, Consumer Reports, and George Soros Open Society Foundation, where she was involved in building Central European University in Hungary. In our conversation, Eileen kept coming back to the theme of advocacy's broadest challenge, to keep progressing and sustaining change over the long haul. As Eileen explained, the only way to sustain progressive organizing is by getting people involved and having activists and leaders who are committed to carrying on the effort. You'll want to listen all the way through this episode to hear about Eileen's recent work to counter the homegrown threats to American democracy. She's been working with opinion researchers and scholars who specialize in political violence to gain a deeper understanding of the Trump personality cult, Christian nationalism, and racism and anti-Semitism. The podcast has had a this is your life aspect to it for those old enough to remember the TV show where celebrities, third grade teachers, and junior high crushes would come on. Anyway, Eileen Hershenov very much fits this pattern because Eileen and I were colleagues in our first jobs out of college, which were with the New York Public Interest Research Group. And we don't need to say when that was. But one of the impressive things about the cohort of people who worked there is how many of us went on to have careers in organizing and advocacy. And Eileen has had an illustrious career indeed. She is an attorney who has served as in-house counsel for organizations including Wikipedia and the Open Society Institute, working for George Soros's philanthropies. This role, of course, also included being involved in the organization's policy work. And most recently, she's been senior vice president and then after that, responsible for democracy initiatives at the Anti-Defamation League. Welcome, Eileen. Thanks so much for doing this.
Thanks, David. Thanks for having me. It's great to see you again, or to be with you again.
Eileen and I have kept up a little bit through Facebook, and where she regularly makes reading recommendations, and I let Eileen tell me what to read, which is a high honor indeed, given how picky I am. But so speaking of lawyers, we were talking earlier about issues of rights and the protection of rights and the unintended consequences of defending rights through the legal system and the courts versus the political system. Say some more, if you would, about that. Clearly, reproductive rights is a very troubling example of this, but pursuing those different avenues, the contexts are different, and that matters.
It does matter, and I don't think it's an either or. I think the difficulty is when to push more on litigation and when to continue to push more on political mobilizing. I guess overall, I think it's unfortunate that a lot of the civil rights work over the last few decades has been professionalized through lawyers. And there have been many great victories. One that was really surprising and came through the courts more than anyone expected was same-sex marriage. So it's not that there haven't been victories, but I think it has been at the expense of attention to organizing and mobilizing. And I don't think you can have and keep your wins unless you're mobilizing both around partisan and issue politics and building something that, frankly, you can never rest on. So I do think that we've focused too much and we've made, the civil rights lawyers, yes, they have clients or class actions, but it's all about the lawyers through court as opposed to building up a movement and constantly iterating on it to, deal with the fact that elections have grave consequences, and also that you need to empower and consistently empower new generations of people to protect civil rights and liberties.
we've had an unfortunate experience. There is also a live by the judiciary, die by the judiciary aspect to it too, I think, right? We have both read the big book about the history of the struggle for LGBTQ marriage equality. And I'm actually at the part of the book where a lot of the strategists are sort of seeing the limitations of the legal argument, particularly as it resonates with the voting public. And there's the part where they're kind of trying to figure out what's the most persuasive. But the problem with, live by the courts, die by the courts is that, when you lose, that sort of comes with, it serves as a roadblock. Yes?
Yeah, that's so true, David. But I mean, let's look at same-sex marriage. We're ultimately going to the courts, which was there was a lot of dispute. There's a lot of feeling among the folks, the activists in support of same-sex marriage, that it was premature to go to the courts and there was going to be a huge loss that would put things back for years, maybe decades. That turned out, surprisingly to many of us, not to be the case. But the reason that legal precedent, in a time when precedents we now see can be so horribly overturned, is somewhat sturdy, is also because of the political mobilization that went on around it. And that was a lot of showing people that, they knew someone, they had a neighbor, they had a family member who was in the LGBTQ community. And some of that, even though it's very labor intensive and doesn't have the immediate nationwide or statewide effect of a win in the courts, is so important because because of the way we're structured with elections and in this country, there's a lot of disproportionate power in certain states and certain localities. So the kind of work that even our former NYPIRG colleague David Fleischer did with deep canvassing, that is labor intensive but gets a few people, because that's all that's needed in a very conservative district, realizing, I know someone who's gay, or this person is in front of my door right now, and they don't want more rights, they just want the same, and it's not hurting me. That helps ground the legal precedents in a change of culture and a change of attitude that's really important. So there's an interplay there, in addition to what's the best strategy at any time. And I think we over-professionalize and legalize the campaign for civil rights at our risk. And, but I would never say don't do those, because I guess, you need both. And the magic is, when do you use one and when the others? I mean, elections have huge consequences. We look at the Supreme Court with Trump, and so many other things where you can use the law to enshrine an anti-majoritarian, authoritarian populist view. I mean, again, there's no one magic bullet here, because we think of civil rights as protecting minorities. We also now are faced with something that's anti-majoritarian to the deficit of marginalized communities. So I think there has to be an interplay, and I think a lot of very educated, somewhat elite civil rights advocates have turned away from organizing to the courts and put civil rights and how we look at it and how we progress in it into the hands of those lawyers, and that professionalism in the courts too much.
Right. I mean, we've been getting abject lessons in how the courts are not separate from politics, not.
Definitely.
We were talking before also about everything, all the pieces of trying to accomplish change. And we talked about what sounded like a really fascinating example from your career of trying to reduce the number of infections that hospital patients get during hospital stays. And that sounded like a really fascinating effort, and would love to have you talk more about it and tell us.
Sure. Well, this example took place when I was the general counsel at Consumer Reports and also working on policy. Consumer Reports is more than a magazine. It actually, at least at that point, had a very robust grassroots arm led by another one. It going to sound like I'm being paid by NYPIRG for this, David, but another former colleague of ours at NYPIRG, Chris Meyer. So I've come and I look at mobilizing, I've come to look at a campaign framework. And a campaign framework, and I'll bear with me a moment, I'll get to the hospital-acquired infections example in a minute. But when I think about campaigns, I'm thinking about what is the goal here and what would be necessary then to protect that goal? Is the goal a piece of legislation? Is it legislation plus? So obviously you have to have a sense of what your goal is. I think if you're an organizer, the goal has to be separate and apart from any specific goal. Are you empowering people to make this change themselves, that they will then go on beyond when you leave leadership or beyond when that issue passes, and ideally be there for at least other issues in the same, say, health thing. That because you want to mobilize something that outlasts. That's the ideal. Doesn't always happen, probably doesn't happen most of the time, but that's the ideal. And then I think I almost have at the risk of oversimplifying, almost mechanical checklist about, is there a legislative trigger we want? Is there a regulatory one? Is there a litigation play here? What about education? Is this going to be, is there a short, medium, and long play here that we should be thinking about, even if we put most resources in one? Is there, is there a communications play, and between and within that, is there certain kinds of social media? What's the best kind of PR campaign that you can do? Is there a market reform, by which I mean organizing to push a corporation or an industry to do something, not through legislation or litigation or regulation, but through other types of pressure? Acquired infections, we had a situation where hospital-acquired infections were killing a lot of people or making them very, very sick, and they were eminently preventable. And we couldn't get anywhere federally. It was just as is the case for so many things today, dysfunction and paralysis. But we thought, okay, if we can have a critical mass of states pass legislation requiring transparency so that it would be well known how each hospital did in terms of hospital-acquired infections, that once you got to a critical mass, it could push over the feds, which is in fact what ended up happening. So we looked at what states are we going to go to, what will be our priority states, who will we go to, which doctors. We had victims of hospital-acquired infections or their surviving families. Very, very important. We had other groups that knew how important checklists, because in many ways this was about having checklists that you rigorously followed. It was a very low-tech solution to a horrible problem. And airline pilots who use checklists, even if they've been flying brilliantly for 30 years, they came and they helped us and they said, this is going to work. This is going to reduce hospital-acquired infections. We had a social media campaign.
Just for anybody new to that issue or unfamiliar with it, that's protocols that the staff would use to kind of remind themselves, take stock of the things that they're supposed to do to prevent infection.
Absolutely. And we used a number of different tactics in this name and shame about particular hospitals or, frankly, particular administrators or health regulators who had flown beneath the radar screen because they're, obscure bureaucrats in a state bureaucracy. That turned out to be effective, too. So it was a campaign that used that sequenced differently at different times and in different states, a lot of different leverage points.
And a big one was this idea, I guess, of report cards, right? That you figured out that that transparency, accountability dynamic, where if you could force these healthcare institutions to disclose how they've done on this, that's the lever.
Report cards and publishing them are so important for any given entity that gets a grade and for the comparative. mean, it's something that I use more recently at ADL when we do report cards on how social media companies do in removing hate speech. Or how well they enforce their content moderation policies. Report cards are important. That was the key thing there was transparency. Often transparency is necessary but not sufficient. Here, transparency was the major goal. The minute that it was announced that some hospital that had a very good reputation was in fact doing quite badly comparatively and preventably in preventing hospital-acquired infections, they had incredible motivation to change. So transparency in this case was one of the few instances I've seen where it was both necessary and almost basically sufficient.
Now it's my turn to go back and remember something from NYPIRG, and that is a big emphasis on winnability. In our other conversation, you were talking about the need for wins along the way. If you could say some more about that.
Yeah, I mean, if you're organizing and something that's, as many campaigns do, is going to take many, many years and be a real uphill struggle, there have to be wins along the way. They could be getting a particular legislator or a governor on board, or a particularly important lobbying group. Or it could be getting a certain amount of, I'm going to date myself now, going around and getting a certain amount of op-eds. This is I'm dating myself to pre-digital, but there's still truth in it. Getting something on a ballot. So there's a lot of things, and you have to build them so that they are wins and they are celebrated and they are seen as wins. And we tried very much to do that in the different campaigns I've been part of. We also often, for key citizen organizers, we would bring in people who had orchestrated successful campaigns so that they would talk about that and talk about that kind of milestone along the way. So it was very carefully cultivated.
And it's important because as you work with advocates, with the non-professional advocates, with the local citizen activists, that sustaining morale. This is crucial for the feeling that we're getting somewhere, and that it could still happen because we're seeing these mile markers. Yes,
absolutely.
And then there was the piece about people who've been affected, whose lives have been affected, and bringing their stories into it.
It makes a very big impact. And David, you and I were just talking about this and the double-edged sword that depending on stories can be. So on the one hand, I've come over the years, decades even, to realize that we are, I think, although some dispute this, hardwired to respond to stories. And stories, of course, simplify things. They have usually a beginning, a middle, and an end. So they are a terribly simplified ways to look at things. And yet they grab us. I am grabbed. Even I, who deal with huge amounts of big data all the time. I put surveys into the field. I look at this. I am grabbed by the stories. They are what stay in my mind. On the other hand, the stories can flatten something to the detriment. And I'm really mindful, again, this goes back to the tech policy work that I've done, in an era of deep fakes, where stories can be created that seem so real and misused. I mean, remember when we saw the role that Facebook played in Myanmar and in India, there were these fake stories about groups killing other people that weren't true, that motivated. So stories not only can flatten out something and oversimplify and come back to bite you, but stories now can be misused in terribly potent ways. So, but stories are so important. And I think as somebody who's been more on the left and the progressive side of things, I think we've reached very hard for stories because it's always seemed to me that the opposition has done a great job of oversimplifying and telling a simple story because it's, it's a one issue deal or it's something that, stories are easier. And democracy, for example, and getting things right is big and messy and multifaceted. So I want to compete on the field of stories, but somehow know how double-sided and flattening that can be. So I have no answers there, but I do not think we can get rid of stories. And I think when you have, unlike, say, money in politics, you have something like hospital-acquired infections, it would be organizing malfeasance, malpractice, to not bring the folks that have a story to tell about that can make other people relate, very centrally into the picture.
But I think what we're talking about is there's no bright line separating, on the one hand, the personal resonance that stories have from, on the other side, manipulation.
I mean, I think that's why organizers also, we have to be thinking of the immediate, the medium, and the long games, right? No organizer I've ever talked to has come up when I say, ultimately, what do we have to do? What do we have to do to change this, to build a more engaged citizenry? It's different types of education. So I think, again, ideally, one can't always do this for any number of reasons, but ideally, when you're running a campaign on a certain issue, or whether it's a partisan or an issue-based campaign, you should be thinking about, what am I building that will outlast this? What's the medium game? If I empower people and then we all go home, if we're lucky enough to win, what have I done? And I think, that's also going back to something we talked about earlier, what happened with Roe versus Wade. We thought we won and we went back home. And we didn't deal with the pipeline of decades of advocacy and organizing that was coming on the side against that, even when a majority of Americans are squarely in favor of the right to abortion.
Yeah, it sounds like what you're saying about mobilization is that when you have a constituency, when you have a group of people deeply committed to an issue, there's that packs a punch, more than any other or mechanism to, as you say, sustainability and sort of perpetuating that concern and achieving progress. But then the other problem, when we talk about depending on story too much, I think what we're talking about, just to clarify, is the extent to which, when you talked about data, right, the extent to which story crowds out other forms of debate.
That's so true. I guess, and I'm very big, I think I remember Consumer Reports going back to the hospital-acquired infections, our sort of mantra was evidence-based medicine, evidence-based, and it certainly is now in my latest gig at ADL. It is, when that just gets swept out by a counter story or but it has no appreciable effect. I mean, I remember showing in 2008 being in North Carolina and showing a group of college-educated women what I thought was absolute undeniable proof that Barack Obama was an American and was not Muslim, happened to be Christian, and it didn't matter. It just didn't matter. And I don't have any good answers for that other than, when I think about how labor-intensive organizing is, I also think that you don't have to bite off the whole nation or the whole state. You talked about how frustrated you are just in your city, so maybe you're going to counter what I have to say next. But I think that so many threats are at a local and state level. And so when we organize, we can bite off looking at something. I mean, especially in states that are so up for grabs in our national map, like Wisconsin or Arizona, Pennsylvania, Michigan. And I'm talking about, I know, a partisan map here too, but it also maps to all sorts of progressive issues that we care about. And I think if you start, you really do start local and you start working on that. And then again, it's like, what's your short, medium, and longer term? What part of it is, what's your leadership play? So is there a group of citizen activists? They're not that many. They might not win right away, but you're going to, sort of funnel them through understanding more about evidence. You're going to work on education. It is long and it is time consuming, and I don't know of any better answers. I mean, we have to be fighting to preserve our democracy, to preserve rights and liberties on so many different fronts, and we can never rest on our laurels. But I'm also mindful, this is anecdotal, but as I go around the country, given the work I do, I am finding more and more diverse groups of younger people that are mobilizing and are active. And there's a lot of, I take a lot of hope from that. But it is unbelievably frustrating when you marshal the evidence and it's overwhelming and none of it matters because someone tells a counter story or someone just says, I don't care, I know I'm right. And we seem to have tens of millions of Americans who are in that camp. How do we begin to peel some of them off?
That question of, I don't know whether to maybe think of it as a ripple effect, but the question of, these different levels of government, these different levels of politics. And let's loop back to your quick reference to deep canvassing. Deep canvassing is engaging with somebody who's has the opposite political view and trying to soften that. It's canvassing in the sense of talking to people as voters and in their local context, but more than a few minutes at their front door, right? And that that reminded me that I think we are talking about, when I say ripple effect, that the grapevine really works in terms of public sentiment, right? People talk to each other, and a lot of the time when you're talking to someone, in a sense, you're talking to everyone they talk to. I don't know if that is also, kind of squared with your experience and what you've observed.
It is. It goes to, endless conversations we have about leveraging impact and how do you scale. And of course, we're all very hopeful. And look, you see certain influencers or you see what makes a show on TV suddenly take off. There's a grapevine effect that is really important. With deep canvassing on same-sex marriage, they did a lot of empirical evaluation of that afterwards, and it was really quite impressive. But the numbers of people that they persuaded away from their view were, overall would seem to the casual observer pretty low. However, they were high enough to swing because it was these were closely fought issues when it came to a referendum or other kinds of votes. So if you did deep canvassing in the right jurisdictions, you persuaded enough people to make a difference in that vote. And what folks who did the deep canvassing so successfully in that way for same-sex marriage are now looking at, does this translate to trans rights? Does this translate to other types of civil rights and civil liberties? Does this translate to believing that the 2020 presidential election was illegitimate and was really run by Trump? And I don't know that it translates, and I haven't seen the results of the work that's being done to see if it translates from same-sex marriage. But again, in the case there, if you carefully targeted where you were doing the deep canvassing, you could actually swing things separate and apart from what you hope would be what you mentioned, the grapevine effect that would occur as well.
When you talk about the building over time and the sustaining past the current moment and trying to build something that has some momentum and has some life and has people invested and engaged over time. A lot of what we talk about in our work is, longer term versus shorter term change, ambition versus incrementalism. And one of the things that really interests me, I'd love it if we could get to a place where that becomes a both and, where we can build a sort of a virtuous cycle or positive relationship between more ambitious forms of change that we can't attain right away, and those things that we can that weighs on you as well.
No, it does. Although sometimes I get frustrated by the abstraction of the debates, and I want to anchor it in something that we're actually doing. I mean, look, we live in a country that I think has always been and may for a foreseeable future be kind of a center-right country. And it's there's been a lot written. There's been a resurgence recently about the sort of individualism that does not exist in many other countries and places in the way, and the sort of founding principle deeply baked in and manipulated too, that it does here. And we're fighting against, such distrust for different reasons on the right and left in institutions and government, often for very good reasons. The breakdown of unions, there are no unions anymore, local news, there are a lot of headwinds, but we've come to such a precipice, whether it's climate change or will we tip over into an illiberal democracy or a budding autocracy, things that maybe people like me paid lip service to intellectually that were possible, but didn't really understand till the last few years that it is in fact actually really possible, and sometimes has seemed probable. So I think we're at a number of precipices that are unprecedented in years or decades or ever. And the country does have a history of coming back for the brink and mobilizing. I mean, you think about World War II, or mobilizing, around the Depression in some ways that give some degree of hope. I think you can't, it's so hard with these headwinds and with a 15-minute news cycle and on the speed of light, social media and the attention span and the lack of civics education, all of these things are difficult. And so I think you're so right that we have to be focusing on both. How do we do that? What's the organizing infrastructure, leadership infrastructure, both at local and higher levels? I don't think the progressives have done a good job with that. I mean, I think there is a certain, I don't want to overstate it, but I think that the right, coming out of 1964 and the defeat of Goldwater, has built up narratives and understanding and single issue politics and pipelines for leaders and education. And I don't know that we can take a page from that book and just flip it, or we have to come to something else. I think, it's been disheartening how we haven't figured a way to counter that. This gets to all of the despairing, the Democrats, once again, it's a circular firing squad, and all of this. But I think you're right in that we have to be thinking about incrementalism and big ambition, and mobilizing, and maybe it's different people mobilize for the different parts of that. But I, as you can tell from my rambling, clearly don't have a good answer for that one.
Yeah, but you put your finger on some important pieces. But at a fairly deep structural level, the country is split between there's large segments of opinion on the left and on the right. We have a two-party system. Looking beyond the immediate test of commitment to democracy and how one party is defecting from that. We share the country, but in this political moment, we're paying the cost for the fact that the other side plays the long game much more seriously.
And look, Democrats and Democratic administrations have deserted working people and the middle class also. I mean, I when I was canvassing in some purple states during elections recently, it was interesting to have the firsthand experience of very articulate anger at a progressive meritocracy or a democratic meritocracy, and the contempt that people felt that meritocracy looked at them with. I mean, these are again things you hear again, but I was hearing it time and time again. I don't know what to say. You also, and this is just a classic playbook too that I saw in my years of working in the former communist countries in the former Soviet Union, the authoritarian playbook, the use of simple enemies, the simple other. And here in the United States, the fault line is so along race, not only, but frankly, primarily. And, one of the books you mentioned, you paid me a compliment that you look at what I recommend to read. I was very impacted by a book that came out a few years ago, Dying of Whiteness, where it looked at states that had refused to have Medicaid, Obamacare Medicaid, even when it was going to be paid almost exclusively by the federal government. And they said, no, we're not going to do that. We're not going to do that. Socialize things. We're not going to raise the people that don't deserve it. And Dying of Whiteness looks at states one right after another where they had the Obamacare come in with Medicaid, and the people who have different cancers, we're talking working class and poor people, are having much better outcomes. And yet you're interviewing the people where they decided not to have it because of all these culture wars. And you're still saying, well, even, you have people saying, even if it means I'm sick, I am not going to go with that, helping blacks and welfare and so on and so forth. So I just make that point because I do, I've gone back and forth on, class, race, different intersections. Race is so fundamental to the problems as they manifest here. But the fact that we have tens of millions of Americans who will reach for, conspiracy theories like the big lie, great replacement, QAnon, have a simple other that is, that you can't have solutions for democracy when you flatten it to this one-dimensional thing. Well, it is the fault of the Jews or satanic pedophiles or democratic elites or brown immigrants coming over the southern border. And so you just completely turn, it's the authoritarian playbook everywhere. You completely turn everyone into focusing on that. And there's no will or ability to look at the many multifaceted ways in which you have to understand problems and attack them. So this conspiracy theory traction is unreal.
I think I hear you saying that othering is central to what we're seeing, and it's definitely central to whiteness to be better than Black people, right? And the Heather McGhee book also is very good on this.
I'm sorry, who is that?
Heather McGhee.
Heather McGhee, yes,
right,
former head of Demos.
Title, unfortunately,
she was on the Consumer Reports board when I was general counsel there. She's a very important thinker and activist on this.
But yes, let's talk definitely for the remaining time about your recent work, which has been on this basically existential threat to democracy, right? Dark political forces have been unleashed, and as you point out, they may be, in a new form and guise at this moment, but this country has seen it before. Other countries have seen it, are seeing it, and that's the thing about an existential threat. If we don't kind of get majority rule back, get the affirmation that the will of the majority guides self-government, we really are at very serious peril.
Right. And this is what, for those who hope that demographic change would ultimately, usher in a progressive era of great length, I think that it's not clear to me these are the dying gasps of reaction. I think that you can ensconce a minority rule, a very reactionary minority rule, and we are set up to do that in many, many ways, and of course moving to try to do that even more. And so that is truly terrifying. I mean, the mainstreaming of once extremist fringe belief is unprecedented in many, many decades. So, the experts on political violence say it's not really since 1860 that we've had this kind of threat from political violence, not because we're in danger of a civil war, the federal government is just too strong, but the kind of domestic terror, in this case right-wing. It hasn't always been right-wing domestic terror in the United States, but for the past 15 or so years, and for what we're facing, that is the far more exigent and existential threat than anything from the left. However illiberal and problematic it may be at times, that is not the current huge threat. So this is unprecedented. So we have the biggest rollback of civil rights and civil liberties I've seen in my adult lifetime, and this surge of attraction of conspiracy theories and white once fringe extremist thought. So I've been focused most recently on a narrower part of that. One of the things that we've seen, and I'm working with Professor Bob Pape of the University of Chicago on this. One of the things we've seen is that it's been very steady through midterms, through the January 6th committee, through the indictments and convictions of January 6th insurrectionists. There's still about 13 million Americans who have steadfastly said that force is justified, even if it results in considerable personal injury and death, to put Trump back into office and to preserve the rights of whites. The two biggest motivating beliefs, other than the belief in the big lie of those people, are the Great Replacement theory, which essentially says some group of globalists or democratic elites, globalists is often a code word for Jews, are orchestrating the overtaking of white Christian European heritage America by brown and black people, by immigrants and others. And that there's essentially, in its white supremacist original form, a white genocide going on. But Great Replacement theory, in one way or another, maybe the slightly nicer way of putting it that Tucker Carlson used to do, that is one of the two big motivating beliefs, along with the QAnon conspiracy theory, that there's a satanic pedophile ring of democratic elites or global elites that only Trump can defeat, that motivates the folks who also believe that most support using force to put Trump back or preserve the rights of rights. At ADL, where I've been working the last 5 years, we also know that there's this surge of anti-Semitism and other forms of identity-based hate, and that conspiracy theories like Great Replacement and QAnon are either founded on or rife with anti-Semitism. So the current survey that Chicago and we that I came up with and put into the field with 8,000 people nationally representative is looking for the first time very directly. Sample. Yeah. So it means it's a huge sample and a very low margin of error. They're looking we found, and we'll be publishing this in September, extraordinarily high levels comparatively of certain types of hate, and particularly anti-Semitism, but not only, among those people that most want to use political violence. Now, actually, that's true on the left and the right. It's about twice as more true on the right. So I'm looking at how do different types of anti-Semitism and others of identity-based hate, and in particular the types of identity-based hate that find traction in conspiracy theories, map over with those people who think we should use force to put Trump back in office or preserve the rights of whites. Now, research is only as good as it has a return on investment in advocacy. I'm hoping that this will speak to some more conservative, but not, lost in MAGA audiences, and will also help with coalition work. But it is very, it was a hypothesis I had. When you see this kind of data and you see the levels of hate, I just have to put it that way. I mean, I was so stunned. And I don't know how we put that back under a rock. I know different ways that we have to experiment. And I read a lot of the people that say overall, because we're never going to get totally rid of it. How do we put it back into the fringe? And you're never going to be able to do that until you have really just very important conservative voices speaking up far more than they are now. We cannot do this just on quote unquote the left. We are not going to be able to put this back under a rock without conservatives speaking up.
A moment when, two-party system, one of the parties has defected from democracy. And so just one party, the Democrats, whatever anyone else might think of the Democrats, we are committed to democracy and preservation of the rule of law and respect for the results of elections. And so it's a challenge of, I suppose it's eventually to have that other party regain its sanity.
Yeah.
But in the meantime, it's Democrats winning, which is what, people who've left the Republican Party.
In the meantime, you have to win in a few key places. Luckily, it's a few key places. I don't know. Speaking, did you ever read Ionesco's Rhinoceros? And you're talking about
back in school.
Yeah, the themes of conformity and fascism and culture and mob mentality. I think that that it's interesting too that this is happening all over the world at the same time, and there's so much back and forth that goes on between those who are leading this. But I look on the international stage. I hope what happens in Ukraine. I don't know. It was looking at what was going on in Iran, and now, and then even China with COVID and the lack of success we now know they had. The narrative that a liberal democracy or autocracy was better than democracy is also showing some phrase, and maybe that's at a very elite academic discussion. But there was a narrative there that was getting more and more compelling, and there are counter narratives that we have to play out at from the local to the state to the national to the level. But yeah, we have to right now. We have to preserve from tipping over. So we got to just be hard nosed and win in a few places, and keep winning. And then at the same time, boy, the medium and long game. I'm terribly worried about the sort of tech stuff. Maybe I got really dosed into that when I worked at Wikipedia, which I think is one of the great successes of, the first generation or generation and a half. It's not unflawed, but it is a great success. It shouldn't work. The kind of crowdsourcing and how accurate it is. So I don't know if you can extract it to other places, because an online encyclopedia is different than a social media site. But I'm very concerned, and we need a lot of thinking about digital education.
Have we learned anything about, now that we understand what we need, right, which is to form a broad coalition of the preservation of democracy? have we learned anything about the key messages? What so when you were talking about marriage equality, part of that story is some learning about what is most persuasive. Have we learned anything about what breaks through to those crucial voters, those center right voters?
Let me flip that a little bit. I think that there's message and there's messenger. So I want to talk first about messenger, because the messengers need to be like when we were talking about the same-sex marriage, that it was LGBTQ folk doing the deep canvassing or being in everyone's, but who the messenger is. We just talked about conservative voices. We talked about young voices. We have to, the Latino community is growing so hugely in the United States. And a lot of people in the progressive side used to say, like, they automatically thought, well, that's going to be, non-white. Lots of Latinos think of themselves as white, by the way. So that tipping point that everyone said was going to happen in 2032 or whatever, not clear. Also, a lot of conservative strains there. So I think, who are the messengers in different parts of it? It's not a monolithic community, in different parts of the Latino community, in different parts of the Black American community. So messenger and, sort of diverse groups of leaders and people coming together on local and state levels, and who the messenger is really important. I suspect the message is different for different folks. I think that, I like the idea of getting certain influencers who are not the legacy leaders of civil rights organizations, but other influencers, bringing them together in different ways to deeply think about values-based leadership, or what kind of messages. I think, so I think about this organizing all the different places of messenger, and some of which I'm saying, let's ask those messengers what messages work. Of course, we're all doing all these, A/B testing, what message works the best for this, that, and the other thing. And that's important. But I think we have to stop being a small group of people talking about this, find the messengers, and give them the resources to come up with the messages. That's oversimplified too, but it's not done enough.
No, I mean, that sounds right. Well, thank you for your work on that. And for coming and sharing it here, and engaging in this conversation, which I really enjoyed, and
me too, David. Thank you.